Hello, today is March 7, 2023. An incident that took place the other day confirmed this. Once again, a sabotage group of Ukrainian volunteers carried out a historic operation in bars. The sabotage group hung Ukrainian flags on Suslucha in Bryansk, Russia. The Kremlin called for a state of emergency. After this operation, a great unrest has begun in Russia. It has been on the agenda for a long time that the Russian-Ukraine war would spread to Russian borders. This is because the Russian army is running out of soldiers and equipment every day. This situation causes a setback against Ukraine and a withdrawal from the occupied. The Ukrainian army, strengthened with the help of Western and European countries, is not only repelling the Russian invaders from Ukrainian territory, but also targeting the Russian invaders' military points on the Ukrainian border. In recent months, Russian leader Vladimir Putin has admitted that the war could spread to Russia at any moment, so much so that the Russian army installed anti-aircraft systems on the government buildings on the streets of Moscow. What Putin feared happened to him. The war has spread to Russia. Ukrainian flags are flying in the towns of Sushi and Lash. Moreover, it was not the power of the Ukrainian army that crossed Russia's borders, but the successful operation of sabotage groups of volunteer Ukrainian citizens. Let's analyze the developments in Sushi and Lane together. Ukrainian stage groups have carried out many successful operations since the beginning of the Russian-Ukrainian war. These operations were not limited to repelling the invaders from Ukrainian territory. Beyond Ukrainian territory, sabotage groups are also seen as the perpetrators of many operations in Russia. Ukrainian sabotage groups and Cartesians are blamed for the mysterious killings of occupation commanders and officials in Russia. In addition, many fires and explosions in Russia with unknown causes and perpetrators also bring to mind Ukrainian sabotage groups and Cartesians. In our previous reports, we have covered the operations of Ukrainian sabotage groups and Cartesians and what happened the other day may be the most effective of these operations because Russia lost 2 towns. As a result of this operation, Ukrainian sabotage groups attacked the town Sony and Bryant the other day. In groups of 50, the sabotage groups conducted detailed investigations before this attack. The reason for these was to identify the targets of the occupiers in the town. Ukrainian sabotage groups frequently flew reconnaissance drones in the area days before the attack. The footage recorded by the drones was watched by every member of the sabotage group that was going to participate in the attack. Because the operation was a land operation and everyone had to dominate the area, the members of the sabotage group worked for days for the operation in the town of Sushi and completed their prepare. Now they were minutes away from entering the town. The leaders of the 50-man groups agreed on the radios to launch the attack. At the same time, the leader gave the command to start the attack. Hundreds of sabotage group members entered the town with Sushin. At the same time, the Russian occupiers were surprised by the simultaneous attacks on the targeted area. The occupiers were unaware of the scale of the attack. The invaders in different regions thought that the attack was only on that region and asked their friends in other regions for help, but their friends were in trouble too. Russian radios were jammed with hundreds of soldiers talking at the same time. Each of the Russian invaders was left to his own fate. Ukrainian sabotage groups captured small Russian. Having seized military vehicles and weapons from these units, the sabotage group members then moved on to larger units. This was planned before the attack, and the plan worked successfully. The Russian occupiers now understood the scale of the attack. They had to choose between death or surrender. Dozens of Russian soldiers died in the first moments of the attack. Soldiers who did not support Putin's decisions to invade chose to surrender rather than to die for Putin. As a result of the sabotage group's attacks, dozens of Russian soldiers surrendered and were taken host. All occupiers in the town of Suzy were neutralized by death, injury, surrender, and hostage-taking. Russian bases and troops in the town are now in the hands of Ukrainian sabotage group. One by one, the flags of the Russian occupiers have been removed from those areas and replaced by Ukrainian flags. Ukrainian flags are flying in the town of Sushi, another town where the Ukrainian sabotage group flags with Lucha Lewin is also located in Barons. SCO Blast sabotage groups managed to capture this town in a very short time because the number of Russian occupiers in this town was. The sabotage group made a statement. After capturing the towns of Soin-Lachain, they stated that Putin's occupation activities in this region were prevented, and the Russian people in the region were freed from Putin's oppression. They promised freedom and peace to the Russian people in the region. Berlin was done by the attacks of sabotage groups of Ukrainian volunteers because in a very short time, 2 towns, dozens of soldiers, and tons of ammunition were completely. The Kremlin called for an emergency. Russian leader of Vladimir Putin was in a state of shock because during the the attacks of sabotage groups on Briscoe blast explosions occurred within 100 miles of Moscow. Putin cornered does not know what to do in the face of these attacks. There have been repeated explosions in Kolona near Moss. There were many comments about the explosions, but the Ukrainian army came to mind first because the unmanned aviation center of the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation is located in Kologna. This could be the next target of the Ukrainian army. Images of the explosion in Kologna were shared on social media. In addition, local people made statements about the explosion. Eyewitnesses said the explosions were carried out after a whistling. However, the exact information about the attack has not yet been shared. This explosion brought to mind a recent development. Russian news agencies reported an unmanned aerial attack on Russia about 24 hours before the explosions in Kologna. Although this news was not confirmed, it alarmed the Russian government. Russian leader of Vladimir Putin therefore decided to close the airspace over St. Petersburg, but Putin's decision proved to be useless. Given the explosions and the loss of 2 towns, Russia leader of Vladimir Putin made a big mistake with his decision to invade Ukraine. After the invasion began, most of Putin's decisions failed. Igor Jurkin, a former Russian military officer, said that Putin's decisions throughout the war were irrational and that he pursued them with stupid stubbornness. The 70-year-old Russian leader continues to endanger Russia with his irrational. People keep calling on Putin to stop the occupation as soon as possible, but Putin does not give up on the occupation for his own political career and reputation. One wonders what Putin, who is getting more and more cornered with each passing day, will do in the coming days of the war. How do you evaluate the successful operations of the Ukrainian sabotage groups? Next intel. The most difficult part of a war is accepting defeat. The defeated country is forced to make many agreements and reparations. It also suffers a serious loss of faith. That's why no country wants to accept defeat in a war, and Putin has never accepted it until now. But things are changing now, one after another. Explosions on the bridges used by the Russian army. Interesting developments in New Ukraine. Let's start if you are ready. The Russian army has been suffering a major defeat in Ukraine for a long time. On all forms of the war, the Russian army is suffering heavy losses. According to the Ukrainian Defense Ministry, more than 150,000 Russian soldiers have been killed since the beginning of the war. In addition, hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers have been hospitalized with injuries. This shows how much the Russian army has been defeated in. One of the areas where the Russian army suffered the most losses is the Ta of BMO. The Russian army was planning to win this war by capturing Kiev. The main roads leading to Kiev passed through the city of BMU. The Russian army had to capture BMU in order to advance the Kiev. Therefore, the fighting in this area was intensified. The Russian army sent its largest battalion too. However, the Ukrainian army managed to neutralize most of the Russian troops center this region. After the Russian army suffered a major defeat in this region, there was a big debate in the country. There was a huge backlash against Russian commanders for the failure of the Russian army in this region. The Wagner group stepped in and sent their mercenaries too, but the Ukrainian army won a great success against them too. The soldiers of the Wagner group suffered a lot of casual. The soldiers of the Wagner group had not coordinated with the Russian army before going to the city. This led to even more tension between Wagner and the Kremlin. The success of the Ukrainian army has also led to political crises in Russia. The Russian army sent its best soldiers soak. They launched many operations, but the Russian army has not succeeded in any. The Russian army lost its best soldiers in this region. Many Russian soldiers were captured. Russia has realized that it can no longer win the war in this region. The Russian army had to retreat from the sea to avoid further losses. But this retreat was very risky for the Russian army, because the Ukrainian army could follow the Russian army and make a big advance. The Russian army could suddenly lose control over many square kilometers of territory. The Russian army does not dare, and it could do great damage to the reputation of the Russian army. The Russian army was forced to retreat because it had failed to capture a town. This could make the Russian army look very weak. The Russian army does not want to suffer such a huge loss of faith. They don't even dare to retreat from the. While the Russian commanders were discussing this problem, an interesting solution was proposed. The Russian officer proposed a safe way for the army to throw. However, this method will result in the Russian army no longer being able to advance EU Ukraine. This method proposed by the Russian officer was accepted. After long discussions, the Russian officer wanted the army to withdraw from BMU, but this retreat was not going to be as simple and normal. After retreating, the Russian army wants to blow up bridges and the others. This was to prevent the Ukrainian army from following the Russian army. The Russian army almost made an escape plan. The Russian army started started to implement this plan in some towns and backwards. Two critical bridges were destroyed by the Russian army, one along to Motif River in northeastern Bakhmut, and the other allowed to crow over on BMO route just west of BMU. A Ukrainian soldier spoke to British press about this. The Ukrainian soldier described the moment when Russian missiles destroyed a very critical bridge. He said that a missile attack targeting the pillars of the bridge was all part of an escape strategy. This move of the Russian army surprised the whole world. The Russian army's retreat strategy is being scrutinized. But what the whole world is most curious about is the Ukrainian army's plan of attack. The Ukrainian army is planning to launch a comprehensive operation against Russian targets in BMU. According to information coming from the region, there is a huge movement in the Ukrainian army's ammunition deliveries. The Ukrainian army is withdrawing troops from the vast front of BMU to different areas, and this way it aims to surround the Russian army. If the Ukrainian army succeeds in this operation, the Russian army could suffer another defeat. The Ukrainian army is making all preparations to launch an offensive as soon as possible. On the other hand, it is reported that many different units of the Ukrainian army have been assigned for this operation. The Sheikh Manor battalion of Chacha soldiers serving in the Ukrainian is expected to launch an offensive from the direction of Sor. It is also expected that soldiers from the Free Russia region will join the fighting in Badu. Many different units will take part in the fighting in this area. The clashes in the city resemble a world war. All countries of the world are waiting for the outcome of the fighting in the city. If the Ukrainian army wins the battles in this region, it'll gain a very serious strategic advantage in this world. This will lead to an increase in the support of Western countries for Ukraine. Western countries are increasing their rate. After the successes of the Ukrainian army, the Ukrainian government has been waiting for new military support for a long time. The most important part of the support is military aircraft. NATO countries are expected to send their most advanced military aircraft to the Ukrainian. Whilst the Ukrainian army has these fighter jets, it plans to destroy all Russian bases. NATO players are capable of carrying huge amounts of ammunition. The missiles carried by the plane can even destroy huge structures. If the Ukraine army uses these planes, Russia will have no chance of winning this. The Ukrainian army is waiting for these planes to be delivered to Ukraine as soon as possible, but NATO members are following the course of the war to make a decision. NATO members are making strategic moves as they send support to Ukraine. These steps are shaping world history. What do you think about the destruction of the bridges and backout by the Russian army? Do you think the Russian army will completely withdraw from the city? What do you think about the resistance of the Ukrainian army and back? The next news. Ukrainian lands are witnessing the most violent and hottest clashes in the history of world. While the clashes of the war on land target the Donbass region, the tension in the seas affects the Crimea, one of the most strategic regions of the Black Sea. Since the Crimean Peninsula is currently the key region of the war, both Ukraine and Russia determine their strategies according to this critical region. While the Russians are trying to reduce the Ukrainian threats in and around Crimea to compensate for the heavy losses in Donbass, the Ukrainians are constantly making their presence felt in the peninsula with their drone attacks in and around Crimea. Due to the great fears of the Russians in and around the peninsula, the Black Sea Fleet in the Crimea began to come to the fore. But as we mentioned, the Russians cannot act comfortably in this regard as the Ukrainian drones seriously threaten the Russian Black Sea. In the past days, the activity in the Black Sea had a great impact on the agenda. The Russians made an attempt, like a show of strength, by stating that 13 warships, an 8 caliber and 2 submarine missile carriers are currently in the Black Sea. In addition, the sighting of a Russian warship in the Sea of Ost was the move that brought the tension to its peak. The approach of these warships to a distance of about 200 kilo, threatening Ukraine's borders, also raised the world countries that are allies of Ukraine. As the gradual shortening of borders continues to exacerbate the global effects of the war, China has also signaled that it will continue the long-range deployment of a group of Russian warships after joint naval exercises in South Africa. In addition, Chinese war experts underline that the frigate Admiral Gorskov is ready for the mission to support Russia's Black Sea. But the greatest danger at the moment in Crimea was the presence of 13 Russian warships, an 8 caliber and 2 submarine missile carriers off the Black Sea. Ukrainian forces, on the other hand, constantly monitor the sudden movements of Russian warships and submarines from their base in Novosibirsk. The naval base near the Kerch Bridge is further from the Ukrainian-controlled coast than the famous base in Sevastopol. Still, the unusual movement in this region is of serious. While the temperature of the Black Sea has reached a boiling point, the fact that the military resources of the Ukrainians between Crimea and Khan are also within the danger limits has mobilized the United Kingdom. During negotiations between British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak and Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky, Kiev and London reached an agreement to supply Ukraine with a GM-84 Harpoon long-range anti-ship cruise missiles. After this agreement, it was the Ukrainians' turn to show off. Currently, Ukrainian forces have turned the GM-84 Harpoon missiles, which have the potential to hit 13 Russian warships off the coast of Crimea, towards the danger zone at a range of 240 kilometers. The Russian warships, which will no longer have the chance to navigate freely, will on the contrary fall within the range of Ukrainians' GM-84 Harpoon. On the other hand, a stern warning was given by Ukraine that in case of any danger, a counter-response would not be delayed. Another feature of these cruise missile isles is that their range is 240 kilometers, which is easily enough to threaten the base of the Russian Navy's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. In this way, the Ukrainians gave the Russians the most striking intimidation in history in the Black Sea. Of course, we cannot ignore the support of the United Kingdom in this. As a result, Ukraine is ready to use British long-range missiles to destroy Crimea, a peninsula captured by Russia in 2014. Rishi Sunak has promised to send more military aid to Ukraine after President Zelensky's visit to the UK. Controversy continues over whether other military aid packages will include additional Harpoon or Storm Shadows, air-to-surface anti-ship missile siles. The supply of such weapons to the Ukrainian army may provoke a reaction from Russia, but since the Ukrainian armed forces already have launchers for these weapons, it is likely that first of all, the Ukrainian side will have to take to thwart attacks from Ukraine. It is known how dangerous such missiles can be for the Russian fleet. On the other hand, GM-84 Harpoon missiles can hit ground targets as well as naval targets. This critical military support from the United Kingdom was enough to upset all the balances in the Black Sea between Ukraine and Russia. Prior to Harpoon missiles, the UK had already supplied Ukraine with a range of handheld and portable missile systems. Ukrainian troops were able to use the Starstreak anti-aircraft missiles, as well as the In-Law and Javelin anti-tank missile sites, to a devastating effect on the invading forces. Further support from the UK came in the form of donating hundreds of Brimstone air-launched missiles with a range of 20 kilometers adapted by the Ukrainians to fire from. The UK then sent the Ukrainian Army M50 MLR's rocket launchers to increase the firing range by approximately 435 kilometers and AMM missiles for use with American air defense systems. One of the Western weapons that has proven to be the deadliest against Russian forces in Ukraine is the HIMARS rocket launcher. The American system sent by the UK and mounted on the back of Ukrainian can hit targets 80 kilometers away. With high precision, it can destroy Russian ammunition, depots, and command centers deep inside enemy lines. However, the Russian generals seem to have finally realized the dangers of keeping arsenals so close to the front lines and have begun to retreat from their range. But still, Ukraine needs longer-range missiles to keep hitting these Russian targets. The missiles, which are planned to be sent to Ukraine in the coming days, continue to worry the Russians even more. The Harpoon missile isles cost around £1.2 million each and have a maximum range of 240 kilometers. Storm Shadow missile isles cost around £2.2 million and can fire at targets 565 kilometers. Although the export-modified versions have a significantly shorter range, despite previous concerns that allowing Ukraine to launch cross-border attacks on Russia could escalate clashes, talks are still being held to decide how many additional British long-range missiles can be sent in the coming days. After the United Kingdom's military support to Ukraine, Western allies have softened their stance on sending offensive weapons in recent weeks and seem to have accepted Kiev's arguments that Crimea is the occupied territory, which is a legitimate target. President Biden effectively doubled the range of the Ukrainian military last week by including it in the latest package of American support GLSDB small board land launch bombs that can hit targets 93 miles away. After the donation of the GLSDBs, Ukraine promised not to hit targets in Russia, but the Kiev administration did not specify Crimea among these targets. In other words, the Ukrainian forces can target the peninsula with these ammunition. Zelensky, on the other hand, during his visit to London, thanked a coalition of Western countries for the latest gifts of long-range missiles. The Ukrainian leader underlined that by destroying the air bases deep in the occupied territory, the evil will come entirely from. In recent months, President Putin's generals have begun to withdraw their command centers and weapons depot further from the front line after being targeted by Ukrainians using U.S. rocket launchers. In other words, Russians are aware that the long-range missiles of the Ukrainian forces will pose a great danger, not only in the Black Sea, but also in ground operations. Finally, Siddharth K. Shaw of the Royal United Services Institute, a defense think tank on the subject, explained that the Harpoon anti-ship missiles already supplied by Denmark to Ukraine can be adapted to fire from. Although they are less accurate when attacking ground targets, Kao added that it would also be possible to fire Storm Shadow missiles from the ground, but they're more likely to be mounted on Ukrainian aircraft. In short, the temperature of the water in the Black Sea seems to continue to boil in Donbass. And next breaking news today, the Ukrainian army mobilized all its means to liberate the Crimea and achieve the goals that drove all the invaders from the territory of Ukraine. They want to be in an advantageous position against the Russian attacks by liberating the temporarily occupied areas before the all-out attack planned by the Russian forces in the current war period. The biggest trump card of the Ukrainian forces is airstrikes. Ukrainian forces primarily target strategic points for airstrikes to be more effective. At the same time, the Ukrainian army is making preliminary preparations for the liberation of Crimea, which was shown as the first target by President Volodymyr Zelensky. Kiev forces are fully focused on the southern front to cut off Russia's land corridor, access to Crimea, or to retake control of parts of eastern Ukraine. It has lost since 2022. Within the scope of the Great Crimean Offensive Plan, the Ukrainian forces accelerated their offensives in the direction of Melitopol. The city of Melitopol in the Zaporizhzhia region is an important city that can survey the efforts of the Ukrainian forces towards both eastern Ukraine and the Crimea. We would like to remind you that since the end of February 2022, Melitopol has been occupied by the Russian army. Recently, we see that the Russian forces have strengthened their defense positions in this. The other day, Ukrainian forces launched an attack on an airfield used as a military base by Russian troops in the vicinity of Melitopol. As a result of the attack, the airport in the city and many Russian military resources received a major blow. The first statement about the explosion was shared by the mayor of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov. The mayor stated that the explosion occurred around 1. In addition, Fedorov noted that over the past year he has blown up the Russian military base located at the Mito airport dozens of times. In addition, many Russian soldiers lost their lives in the attacks of the Ukrainian forces on Melitopol. Former administrator of the Ukrainian city of Melitopol, Ivan Fedorov, admitted that he said the attacks targeted Russian military base. Fedorov explained that there were, quote, numerous explosions, including the Christian church of Melitopol, which Russian forces captured and turned into a bunker a few months ago. Fedorov pointed out that Russia has turned Melitopol into a giant military. Ivan Fed stated that this week they witnessed the concentration of Russian forces in the city and his birth city. Melitopol turned into a Russian stronghold. On the other hand, Ukrainian forces launched multiple airstrikes against Russian forces in eastern and southern Ukraine last day. In support of offensives in these areas, the rocket forces and artillery units of the Air Force of the Ukrainian Armed Forces targeted 9 clusters of personnel, weapons, and military equipment, 2 anti-aircraft physics, a war station, and ammunition depot of the Russian troops in the Zapdonetsk regions. While the Ukrainian forces are making various attacks on the Russian forces, the Russians continue their attacks to reach Kiev. However, the Ukrainians deflected the attacks of the Russian forces, preventing the Russians from achieving their goal of gaining territory in the direction of Kiev in an area controlled by Ukrainian forces. An attempt by Russian forces to attack was. Ukrainian air defense forces shot down at least 5 Russian drones over the Poltava region. The examples of successful defense of the Ukrainian forces in Poltava and many other regions did not escape the attention of the President of Ukraine. Zelensky praised the Ukrainian soldiers for defending the country despite the frenzied depression they were under during the war. Ukrainian forces plan to inflict maximum pain on the Russians in preparation for counter-offensive operations. It has been revealed that Russia has seen more losses in the war in Ukraine, which has lasted more than a year and still continues, than all the Russian wars. After the Second World War combined, Ukraine and the government of President followed in Zelensky hope that Ukraine's inevitable victory will come in 2023. The Kiev government survived despite all the harsh. The Ukrainian army was supported by more and more advanced NATO weapons. The Kremlin government hopes to take control of the rest of the eastern Donetsk and Luhansk regions, but war authorities do not think Vladimir Putin's forces have the training supplies or combined arms support to do so. In order for Russia to halt the annexed regions, it must sit at the negotiating table with the Ukrainian forces. But since the Ukrainian forces are not willing to make concessions, no steps were taken for peace talks. Ukraine will not sit at the same table with the Kremlin without gaining a significant advantage on the battlefield. In the early stages of the war, the Ukrainian government was very willing to stop this fierce war through negotiations and did not have any great demands. But after Ukrainian forces had great success against the Russians, the Kiev government announced that they would no longer negotiate until all Russian troops left Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, which was enacted in 2014. In addition to Crimea, the attacks in and around Melitopol indicate that the Ukrainian forces are moving towards the liberation of Crimea in the south. An attack on Melitopol and the Azov Sea coast could isolate and encircle Crimea in the east. Further, loss of Luhansk or Donetsk would be a major defeat for the K. Melitopol is the center of the Ukrainian territory, which serves as a bridge between the Crimean and Russian troops. As soon as Melitopol comes back under the control of the Ukrainian forces, a great life and death war will begin for the Russian troops in the Crimea. If the Ukrainian forces achieve this goal by the end of March, they will be able to save the Crimea from occupation more easily. Maybe Ukraine's best and quickest option to attack Crimea. But as Russia's nearly 30,000 soldiers were wounded around the former Kherson city and Zyzia, it seems difficult for the occupation forces to regroup there. On the other hand, retired Lieutenant General Ben Hodges, who commanded the U.S. Army Europe, pointed out that located at the heart of this route about 96 kilometers northeast of Crimea will be a major battle if Ukraine decides that it should attack there. Protecting the land bridge to Crimea will be crucial for the. Of course, Ukraine can hit the land bridge with long-range precision shots. Currently outside of any shadowy long-range drone stockpile, Ukraine's longest-range weapons are the M142 high-motion artillery rocket systems, or the M30-01 and M31, a 227mm guided multi-launch rocket system munitions fired by the HIMARS and M270 multi-launch rocket systems, and these Warby can easily target the. In addition, Ukrainian forces provide a long firing range with ground-launched small-diameter bomb munitions with a range of 151 kilometers. Such weapons can also pose a threat of attack on the peninsula at any time. So far, Ukrainian forces have not yet fully launched a Zyzia counter-offensive in line with their previous offensive in the Kharkiv and Kherson. But given Zelensky's oath that his troops will definitely liberate Crimea, and Russia's ongoing measures to strengthen the peninsula, the effort to liberate Syria is likely to begin at any moment. Zyzia will play an important role in the liberation of Crimea in the city of Uk, an important transportation hub. In the depths of Zha, a Russian headquarters where Chian troops were stationed was hit with a precision attack. This city appears to be within range of Ukrainian GMLR. Tomak will indirectly play an effective role in the liberation of Crimea. The Russians, on the other hand, began to strengthen their fortifications and trenches around Tomak. Russian forces surrounded the occupied city with fortifications and trenches. In summary, the city of Melitopol, which will positively affect the course of the war for the Ukrainian forces, must be brought under the control of the Ukrainian forces as soon as possible. In order to achieve this goal as soon as possible, Ukraine's Western allies should be more. Thank you for watching us.